Hey everybody, today we are debating the resurrection and we are starting right now. Hey everybody, thanks for being here at Modern Day Debate. Thrilled to have you, and we are thrilled for this debate. I have to say, this is one of the more epic debates I think we've ever hosted. I think you're going to enjoy it. We have a clash of leaders today, and that is Jim Majors, who is the Atheist Republic CEO, and Jonathan McLatchie, the founder of the Apologetics Academy. And so with that, I just want to mention, if this is your first time here, feel free to hit that subscribe button, as we try to host a lot of debates, and we're hopefully going to have you here again, whether you're Christian, atheist. We try to be a nonpartisan channel, which means hold us accountable. If you ever think that either of the moderators are in any way unfair, let us know, as we want to be as fair as possible to both sides. With that, we're going to move into the introductions, and I want to mention Capturing Christianity also has a resurrection debate coming up. It's in April, and that's going to be epic as well, between Mike Winger and Matt Dillahunty. We're thrilled to have you here, but we also want to let you know about debates at other channels so that you can have your choice of which ones you want to check out. Whether it be Capturing Christianity, Non Sequitur Show, Christian, atheist channels, if it's a debate, we want you to know about it. Now for the introductions. As mentioned, Jim Majors is the Atheist Republic CEO. Jim Majors has had numerous debates on textual criticism as well as on the existence of God. And I can tell you, the first time I had him here, I was like, wow. He and Jonathan Sheffield debated, and I said, I am like blown away by how much you guys have read. So I think this is going to be an epic debate. And also very well read, to say the least, Jonathan McLatchie. We're thrilled to have you here as well. Jonathan is the founder of the Apologetics Academy. He is a Christian writer, international speaker, and debater, holds a bachelor's degree with honors in forensic biology, a master's degree in evolutionary biology, a second master's degree in medical and molecular bioscience, and currently is completing his PhD in cell biology. There are a lot of credentials for both of these gentlemen. I could read so many off for both of them. And so with that, I will do our last introduction before kicking it off to our moderator, guest moderator. We're thrilled to have him. I'm going to introduce him and then kick it off to him to start us for the debate. Mike is from Inspiring Philosophy. Mike Jones has had numerous debates on Non Sequitur Show as well as over here, and want to let you know, everybody's links are down in the description, so you can check out Mike from Inspiring Philosophy, you can check out Jim and Jonathan. Even if you don't agree with them, hey, at least you're getting their version of their position straight from them. So it's the most charitable view I think you can get of them by going straight to their channels. And also, Capturing Christianity is linked in the description, as they have their resurrection debate coming up in April, so you can check them out as well. Now, Mike, thanks for being here. We really appreciate you being our guest moderator, so the floor is yours to get us started.
All right, boys, I want a good, clean fight. No hitting below the belt. No yo mama jokes. No aggressive dance moves. Yeah, I'm talking to you, Jim. No, the debate format we have set up here will be 20-minute openings, followed by 10-minute rebuttals, 6-minute cross-examination, 5-minute closings, and then a 25-minute Q&A. So with that being said, we can jump right into it, starting with Jonathan. I'll be keeping time for the first 20 minutes. So, Jonathan, if you're ready, I can hit go, and we can start getting going.
We are good.
All right, go ahead.
Well, it's great to be with you guys. Thank you so much for organizing this debate, James, and thanks for Jim Majors for agreeing to participate in this debate and offer his perspective as well. So this evening we're going to be debating the topic of, did Jesus rise from the dead? This age-old question on which Christianity rests and hangs. For if Jesus has been raised, then that demonstrates the messianic credentials of Jesus of Nazareth. On the other hand, if he has not been raised, then Christianity is in vain. So let's then turn, without further ado, to this question: did Jesus rise from the dead? So, what do we need to explain when we're explaining the origins of the resurrection? We're trying to explain the origins of the belief that Jesus, in fact, rose from the dead, and thereby explain the origins of Christianity. So I'm going to put forward four competing hypotheses that purport to explain the origins of the belief in the resurrection among the early Christians. I think you'll find that all contending explanations for that belief fall into four broad categories. Firstly, the hypothesis that his immediate followers did not claim that Jesus rose again. In fact, the Gospels are later myths. Perhaps the earliest apostles would have been as surprised as anyone else to learn that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Perhaps that didn't originate with them at all. Or, secondly, perhaps his followers were deceived into thinking that he rose again. They were honestly mistaken. We can call that the hallucination hypothesis. Or perhaps his followers deceived others into thinking that he rose again. We can call that the conspiracy hypothesis. And finally, the hypothesis that that Jesus of Nazareth really did rise from the dead. We can call that the resurrection hypothesis. And over the course of my presentation today, I'm going to be evaluating those competing hypotheses for the origins of early Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection. So let's start with our first of those competing hypotheses then, that his immediate followers did not in fact claim he rose again. The gospel narratives concerning the resurrection are later myths that developed much later. Well, let me just give you two lines of evidence. I mean, there's much more than this, but for this purpose of time, I'll just give you two lines of evidence that the earliest apostles of Jesus in fact did claim that he rose from the dead. It's not a later developing myth. The first evidence is the creed quoted by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 7. Secondly, Peter's concerning the resurrection in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 2. So let's then start with the first of those evidences. In 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Corinthians is a letter written by the Apostle Paul from Ephesus in the middle of in about 55 AD to the church in Corinth in Greece. And he says in the 15th chapter, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles." And so most scholars are agreed that Paul is actually passing on here oral tradition, an oral creedal statement, which he has received from the eldership of the Jerusalem church, in particular Peter and James. There's a number of marks or characteristics that are indicative of early date. For example, this mnemonic structure. It's a brief creed, approximately 50 words, designed for ease of memorization. It's rhythmic. The use of the Aramaic name Cephas, which is an early name for Peter, suggests an early origin, and also its delivery to Paul. Paul likely received this creed in Jerusalem shortly after his conversion, where, according to Galatians 1, he met with Peter and James, the very people mentioned in that creed. So that's very probably where he received that oral tradition. However, let's just grant for the purpose of argument that most scholars are actually wrong, and that this is actually not an oral creedal tradition which Paul is passing on. Even if that is the case, we can still make the argument from this text that that the earliest apostles did in fact claim Jesus rose from the dead. And that's because of what Paul goes on to say next from verse 9 to 11. It says, "For I am the least of the apostles. I am unworthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am. His grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preached, so you believed." And so you can see that Paul assumes that the Corinthian Christians understand his proclamation of the resurrection to be consistent with what's already been proclaimed to the Corinthians by the early apostles, in particular Peter, James, and the 12. So then let's turn to the second evidence for the claim among the apostles that Jesus had risen from the dead. And that's in Acts chapter 2, verses 29 through 32. Peter says, according to Luke, "Brothers, I may say to you with confidence about the patriarch David that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we all are witnesses." So you might ask at this point, well, can we trust the author of Luke and Acts are two books in the New Testament written by the same author. Can we trust the author of this two-volume set to be telling us the truth? Can we trust him to be giving us an accurate reporting of what Peter believed? Well, let me give you two lines of evidence to suggest that we can. The first is that Luke Acts says it is grounded in eyewitness testimony with Jerusalem witnesses. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. And secondly, the author reliably worked with Paul and so was present at the Jerusalem church, right with that treasure trove of living witnesses to the resurrection of Christ. And let's start with the first one, that Luke Acts says it's grounded in eyewitness testimony. In Luke chapter 1, in the first 4 verses, written by the same author as the author of Acts, he says, writing to an official by the name of Theophilus, to whom he addressed his books, he says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, as those from, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. You may have certainty concerning the things you've been taught." So Luke claims to have received material and information from those who were at the first eyewitnesses to the ministry, life, and death and resurrection of Christ. In the book of Acts, in chapter 21, he claims to have been present with Paul when Paul went to the Jerusalem church. Luke actually claims in the book of Acts to have been a traveling companion of Paul. And from chapter 16 onwards, he starts to use the inclusive plural pronouns we, indicating that he was traveling with Paul during a significant portion of Paul's travels. In chapter 21, it says, "When we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present." So this indicates to us that Luke had access to the living witnesses to Christ's resurrection. He had access to the Jerusalem apostles. And so that indicates that Luke was in a position to know whether what was being claimed by the Jerusalem apostles concerning Jesus' resurrection. So then let's look at my second argument, that we can trust what Luke Acts is telling us. And that is that the author reliably worked with Paul. And so he was indeed present at the Jerusalem church, right with that treasure trove of living witnesses to Christ's resurrection, just as he claims. Let's look at a few lines of evidence for that. Firstly, Luke has Pauline knowledge of Paul's activities. That is, knowledge of Paul's activities that he could only have gotten by being a traveling companion of Paul. Secondly, Luke has Pauline knowledge of the world. That is, knowledge of the world he could only have gotten or was best explained by him being a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. Thirdly, that Luke indeed traveled with Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea to Rome, which implies that he must have been present in Jerusalem with Paul during that meeting with the Jerusalem elders. But firstly then, Luke has Pauline knowledge of Paul's activities. I'm going to introduce at this point a concept called undesigned coincidences, which is a way of determining the veracity of historical records when we have 2 or more accounts that overlap, and one might, in passing, answer a natural question raised by another, like pieces of a jigsaw fitting together and pointing to the veracity of the account. So here's an example from the writings of Paul's letters and how it connects with the book of Acts in a way that points to the truth of the book of Acts. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17, Paul says to the Corinthian church, "That is why I sent you Timothy," which entails that Timothy has already been sent when Paul is writing to Corinth from Ephesus. We know he's writing from Ephesus in Asia Minor because at the end of the letter he sends greetings from Aquila and Priscilla to Corinth, and we know from Acts that Aquila and Priscilla traveled with him as far as Corinth, and so as far as Ephesus from Corinth, and so that indicates to us that he was writing from Ephesus to Corinth across the Aegean Sea. Corinth, of course, is the capital of Achaia, what we now know as Greece. In 1 Corinthians 16, verse 10, he says, "When Timothy comes, see that you put him at ease among you." So Paul nonetheless expects his letter to arrive before Timothy does, even though he's already sent Timothy at the time of his writing. We therefore infer that Timothy must have taken some indirect route to Corinth, perhaps going up through Troas and Macedonia, the overland route. If we look at a map here, just in case viewers are not visually acquainted with the geography, here we see Ephesus, where Paul is writing his letter to Corinth in Asia Minor, and Corinth being the capital of Achaia across the Aegean Sea. The most natural way to send a letter would be by boat from Ephesus to Corinth. We would infer from those little references in 1 Corinthians, though, that Timothy must have taken the indirect overland route going up through Troas and Macedonia. When we turn to the book of Acts in chapter 19, that's exactly what we see. When Paul is in Ephesus, it says, "Now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while." So indeed, Timothy did go up the overland indirect route, thus illuminating those little references in an undesigned way that points to truth. Secondly, then, Luke has Pauline knowledge of the world. This is cases where we have points of external corroboration from outside the New Testament that shed light on the book of Acts in a way that points to truth. For example, and there's many dozens of these, I could probably give you more than 100 examples of this sort of phenomenon. When Luke tells us, so this is in book of Acts in chapter 18, when Luke tells us of the riot in Ephesus, or chapter 19, he reports that the city clerk tells the crowd that there are proconsuls. Consul is a Roman authority to whom a complaint may be taken, and normally there would only be one proconsul. So why then does it use the plural? Well, just at that particular time, there seems to have been 2 as a result of the assassination of Silanus, the previous proconsul, by poisoning in the fall of AD 54. This event is independently documented by Cornelius Tacitus, a member of the Roman Senate and a historian, in his Annals of Imperial Rome. Indeed, Luke's accuracy has allowed historians to date the event, which Luke narrates with incredible precision, since we know when Silanus was poisoned. Let's then turn to my third category of evidence, that Luke indeed traveled with Paul to Rome. In Acts chapter 20, from Jerusalem. So in Acts chapter 27, we see this narrative where it says, when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners. We, Luke included, put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. In verses 3 through 5, the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. And so there you can see it on the map there, going from Caesarea to Sidon to Myra. And then it says in verse 6 that there they found there the centurion found a ship of Alexander sailing for Italy and put us on board, and they were transferred to a Greek Alexandrian grain ship. Just some background here. As Luke said earlier, there was a famine during the reign of Claudius. That's in Acts 11:28, and we verified this because Josephus also tells us about it. And we know Claudius established this grain fleet that would truck up to 150,000 tons of corn from a Greek city called Alexandria in Egypt. In fact, scholars have actually reconstructed their ancient shipping schedules. Here we see a map of them going to Crete. So this Roman centurion transfers these prisoners to one of these great Alexandrian grain ships, and they end up in Crete. And so just to give you a taste of the authenticity of this voyage with Luke and Paul together, just let me give you 2 evidences, and there's many more than this. First, from here at Crete, they're trying to get from the green dot that you see on the map to the blue dot. In verse 13 and 14, it says, they sailed along Crete, close to the shore, but soon a tempestuous wind called a northeaster struck down from the land. So here's our first evidence. This is actually a well-confirmed wind that rides over Crete from the northeast, and it's strongest at this exact time near the Passover. Now, what's impressive is that the purple dot island, because it says that running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. And this purple dot island called Cauda is more than 20 miles west-southwest of the green dot, where the storm likely struck the travelers in the Bay of Massara. This is precisely where the trajectory of a northeaster should have carried them. And it's not the sort of information someone would have inferred without having been blown there. And ancients found it nearly impossible to
5 minutes.
This far out. In fact, Ptolemy and Pliny the Elder had the estimates in Luke's day, and both would have been thought at the time to debunk Luke's claim here. However, it's Luke's report alone that gets the implied location of the island right. In fact, Colin Hemer, who's written a commentary on the Book of Acts called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History, has said, it becomes increasingly difficult to believe that such details could have been derived from any kind of contemporary reference. So then, as we've shown, we've confirmed that Luke was indeed with Paul in Jerusalem with that treasure trove of living witnesses traveling to Rome. He was with Paul in Acts 21 in Jerusalem. Paul was imprisoned for 2 years in Caesarea, which is close to Jerusalem, and then from there they moved. He was with Paul on that fateful ship voyage on the way to Rome. So then we've eliminated our first hypothesis. What then about the hypothesis? The second hypothesis is just followers were deceived into thinking that he rose again. Well, let me just give you a few criteria for unreliable eyewitness testimony. Under the following conditions, studies have shown eyewitness testimony is typically unreliable if the events happen quickly over a period of seconds or minutes, participants are strangers to one another, or if there's a weapon present, such as a knife or a gun. But notice by contrast the nature of the claimed resurrection appearances in the book of Luke, Acts, and also the other Gospels, which are grounded in eyewitness testimony. Jesus appears to multiple people at once, multi-sensory, involving not just sight, but hearing, conversation, group conversation, touching, etc. And they're extended across time, so not just one brief and confusing episode. Then, having eliminated the second hypothesis, let's then evaluate the third hypothesis, namely that the conspiracy theory, that his followers deceived others into thinking that Jesus rose again. And I'm just going to give one argument against this hypothesis, namely the fact that they were willing to suffer and die as martyrs for this belief. In fact, what did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? Why would they die for a known lie? Many people will die for something they think is the truth, but no one dies for something they know is a lie. Martyrdom of Peter and James, the Lord's brother, are particularly well attested. James, Josephus tells us, died as a martyr. He was thrown from the Temple Mount and bludgeoned to death. I like to ask the skeptic, how much would it take to convince you that your elder brother was the Yahweh of the Old Testament to the point of martyrdom? Something pretty radical, I think. Having eliminated these three contending hypotheses, namely the myth hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis, and the conspiracy hypothesis, I contend then that the best overall explanation of the evidence, the relevant evidences, is in fact that Jesus in fact did rise from the dead, leaving an empty tomb behind him. And the best explanation I would put it to you is one that was given by the angels to the woman at the empty tomb in Mark 16 verse 6. Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. And of course, this is just a small fraction of evidence that we could look at in regards to the resurrection. As you can see from the screen, we've just covered the very pinnacle of the proverbial iceberg. There's a lot more information that could be given on all those points to flesh them out even further. And there's a lot more categories of evidence besides that bear on the resurrection of Jesus. That brings the end of my opening statement, and I look forward to hearing what Jim Majors has to say.
You bet. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. With that, we will now move... Oh, that's right. It's out of habit. Sorry, Mike.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, sorry for interrupting at the 5-minute mark. I was just trying to give you time cues, so I apologize for that. But yeah, so now we'll move to Jim's 20-minute opening statement. Jim, do you want me to just do hand signals, or do you want me to tell you when you have 10, 5, or 1?
You can just tell me I got 5 and 1. That's fine.
5 and 1? Okay, yeah, we'll just do that from now on then, so that way I don't interrupt too much. All right, you ready to go? Starting now.
All right. So around 54 CE, about 25 years after the death of Jesus, Paul writes a letter to a church in Corinth. This church is fraught with immoral beliefs and practices. One of them, one of the things they were struggling with was the resurrection. And Paul tells them in 1 Corinthians 15 that if Jesus did not rise from the dead, that if that's not true, then their faith is in vain. And I could not agree more. Let's look at the best accounts of the resurrection. The 8 best accounts of the resurrection are recorded between 25 and 200 years after the death of Jesus. So right from the get-go, that's problematic. We also know from history that the Romans did not dignify enemies of the state with a proper burial. There was no honor in crucifixion in the Roman world. Those crucified, especially usurpers, were usually left up as a sign of humiliation and a warning to others to not do the same. So there is nothing to show that Jesus was given an honorable burial. In fact, we know from Josephus only that Jews were given a proper burial, but this is also, years after the fact, a couple of generations after the fact. So we don't know what the tradition was at the time of Jesus, but there are some reasons that people were allowed to have bodies taken down for a proper Jewish burial. But in the case of somebody like Jesus claiming to be the King of the Jews, no. We know from accounts of Titus that thousands of people were crucified, so many, in fact, that they ran out of trees. They didn't have enough wood to crucify people. And yet the only evidence that we have for crucifixion is a single ossuary box with an ankle bone with a nail driven through it. And that is out of all those thousands of crucifixions, why don't we have more evidence for crucifixion? It's because those who were crucified were usually left up to rot or to die, and they were thrown into a shallow grave. They were picked by scavengers. So between decomposition and scavengers, all of the pretty much all the evidence for crucifixion, with the exception of the ossuary box and whatever else we haven't discovered, whatever minimal evidence there is still undiscovered out there in first century Jerusalem, is gone. Josephus tells us in the Antiquities of the Jews that whoever blasphemies against God should be stoned, hung up on a tree the whole day, and then buried in an obscure and ignominious manner. So this directly refutes the claim that Jesus was buried in a new tomb that was carved from stone, supposedly by Joseph of Arimathea, whether it was his personal stone or a new stone that he found in a garden. So that was a very uncommon burial practice for somebody to be put into a new tomb, a tomb of which a body had not been laid in. In fact, unless you were an extremely wealthy person, you did not get a used tomb. And if you were a usurper, you most certainly did not get the dignity of entombment. So for starters, the claim, which I'm pretty sure that Jonathan holds to, is that Joseph of Arimathea appeals to Pilate for Jesus's body, to give it a proper burial before sundown, as is Jewish tradition. And Josephus is a member of the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish council. And in Matthew, Joseph isn't only a Sanhedrin member, but he's also a disciple of Jesus. So all four Gospels say that Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body and to put it in a tomb, but these accounts are contradicting. In Mark, he covers the body with a shroud, lays it in the tomb, was carved into rock. There's no mention of the Jewish burial rituals or traditions like washing and anointing the body, wrapping the body, anything like that, with the spices. And let's see. Oh yeah, in Luke, it says that Joseph did not agree with the Sanhedrin decision. But there's a little bit of a problem there, because elsewhere it tells us in Matthew chapter 14 that the Sanhedrin voted unanimously. Yeah, so Luke tells us that Joseph of Arimathea did not agree to their plans and actions. So I guess you could say that, well, maybe he missed the meeting. But in Mark chapter 15, verse 1, it tells us that all of the members of the Sanhedrin were involved. So let's go to John, John chapter 19, verse 31 through 33. It says, since it was a day of preparation, the Jews did not want the bodies left on the cross during the Sabbath, especially because the Sabbath was a day of great solemnity. So they asked Pilate to have the legs of the crucified man broken and the bodies removed. They went and broke the legs of the first and the second who had been crucified with him, but they said they saw that he was already dead and did not break Jesus' legs. So here it was the Jews in general that asked Pilate to break the legs of the crucified man and remove the bodies, except Jesus, because he was already dead. But not for long. But here, Joseph has the help of Nicodemus and John. So what I find really convincing to support my opinion is the earliest accounts of the resurrected encounters with of Jesus come from Paul. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that's where we see Paul trying to convince the people that the belief in the risen Jesus is essential to their salvation and their faith. So he's doing everything that he can to convince them that Jesus rose from the dead. Yet Paul doesn't mention the empty tomb. Being as this is, to many people, the most damning evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, I find it very hard to conceive why Paul did not write about it to the church in Corinth. So not only does Paul not mention the empty tomb, but he doesn't mention any of the supernatural events surrounding the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. No earthquakes, no blacking out of the sky, no angels, no details of the physically resurrected Jesus. So there were a couple of different ancient resurrection beliefs. The Greco-Roman beliefs was that the physical world was corrupt and would corrupt you until you died, but that your spirit was inherently good, or your soul was inherently good. And then Judaism, you had Pharisees and you had Sadducees. Pharisees believed in an end of time resurrection, and the Sadducees, they basically did not believe in anything. They were basically materialist. That's probably too sweeping of a term, but just for the sake of the conversation, that's what I'll call it. So let's talk about the appearances. Paul tells the church in Corinth that Jesus appeared to 500 witnesses. Yet we have no account of any of these 500 witnesses documenting this fantastic account. It seems much more likely that Paul is so concerned with convincing the people in Corinth that the belief in the resurrection is necessary, that he throws out a BS number like 500. That seems much more convincing to me. One of the favorite arguments is the voluntary suffering. The martyrdom of Peter and James are well attested. Peter denied him, and James didn't accept him as the Messiah. Josephus tells us that James died a martyr's death, that he was thrown from the Temple Mount, and that he was bludgeoned to death. But the problem is that there are also other accounts. There's accounts from Clement, from Epiphanius, and from, I'm missing one. Who is it? Josephus. And these are all different ways of execution. Some of them they just get stoned, some of them they get thrown and stoned, some of them they get stabbed with a sword. So it all depends on which external evidence that you have for it. So while you have many that attest that they were martyred, you don't have any that can agree on how they were martyred, or where they were martyred for that matter. Let's see, what else? I guess I can touch on okay, so Paul, I guess we can start with his road to Damascus experience that he had. It's best outlined in with his conversion in Acts. In Acts 9:3, it describes a flash of light around Paul as coming from heaven, and it physically blinds him for a while thereafter. And so it's only Paul was physically blinded, though, even though he was he had traveling companions with him that would have seen what was going on too. Acts 9:7 says that nobody saw what Paul saw. Nobody said, and in the same verse it says that Paul heard a voice, and that while everybody else heard it, they couldn't distinguish it. They couldn't understand it. They didn't know what it was. And if it was Jesus, then they most certainly should have understood that. So that's Paul's version of the encounters is in Galatians 1. I can probably touch on that later. Let's see. Okay, so the empty tomb. In Mark, the witnesses of the tomb see a young man in a white robe, and it's chapter 16, verse 5. In Matthew, there's an angel of the Lord from heaven who had rolled the stone back and set on top of it. And in Luke, there's two men in clothes that gleam like lightning. Mark says that there were three women. Matthew says there were two. Luke says there were at least four, and John says there was one. So if we're looking at this side by side, we say, okay, well, we're just going to go with the biggest number. We're going to go with 4+, right? We're going to go with what Luke says. So if that's true, if there was +4, then why would Why would Mark say there were 3? And why would Matthew say that there were 2? Because that doesn't quite make sense, especially when you're looking at it in context, how they are describing them. A question that I would have about the martyrdom would be, how do you know that the let's just say that I'll give you Peter, James. How do you know that the other 9 disciples now, with Judas and Paul, with Judas, Peter, and James out of the picture? So how do you account for that? There's no, well, we have no evidence of what happened to them. Another thing, if you hold to the prophecy in Psalm 22 where it says Jesus was crushed and his bones were taken out of joint and his heart was melted like wax and his body was poured out like water, does that not violate the necessity of purity for the sacrifice of the Passover lamb? We know that he uses 22 verse 16 where it says that he pierced my hands and feet. But in the Masoretic text, it says, it's important to note that this verse is lacking the verb that's necessary to make this translation viable. The Hebrew in the Masoretic text says that the most agreed upon interpretation says, they bite like a lion my hands and feet. So that's very, very much different than how we see it used. It's because the Septuagint translated to the Greek to say they have dug my hands and feet, which many interpreted as pierced, using this translation. But then you have 22 verse 18 where they say they cast lots for his garments and so on and so forth, therefore retroactively fulfilling prophecy. How much time do I have left?
6.5 minutes.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, so I guess we can. I'll go back to Joseph of Arimathea, and so Mark 15 tells us that evening time comes, so it's around 5:30 or 6 p.m. That's something that scholars agree on pretty much mutually. So a member of the Sanhedrin approached Pilate hours after the crucifixion had occurred, pardon me, and just a couple of hours before, if that, before the cutoff time, before what was considered the appropriate time for a Jewish, a proper Jewish burial. So a member of the Sanhedrin waited up until that point and asked for Jesus's body. Even though in Mark 15 verse 1 it tells us that all the members of the Sanhedrin were involved, it says it was morning. The chief priest held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And Matthew chapter 14 verse 64, it says the unanimous decision by the Sanhedrin was that Jesus had committed blasphemy, and it says, quote, all of them condemning him as deserving death. So it was a unanimous decision that he had committed blasphemy and that he should be put to death. So I find it hard to believe that somebody who's a supposed disciple of Jesus and a member of the Sanhedrin would both condemn and facilitate would both condemn Jesus to death and then facilitate his proper burial. And also, as a counselor of the Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea would be unclean for a week after touching the body of Jesus, thus preventing him from eating the Passover meal, which is inarguably the most important Sabbath meal at the time. Matthew 27:57 and 58 tells us, when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. That kind of sounds like Joseph of Arimathea. But when you read the prophecy Matthew is referencing in Isaiah 53, it also says that he didn't just make his grave with the rich, but he made his grave with the wicked. So is he the wicked one? The Sanhedrin member? Additionally, Acts chapter 13, Luke tells us that after the Sanhedrin had carried out everything that was written about Jesus, meaning the whole passion narrative, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb. But the author of Acts does not mention Joseph of Arimathea. Why is this? Who is Joseph of Arimathea? Did Joseph of Arimathea have help of Nicodemus? Let's see what Luke says about Joseph. He says, now there was a good and righteous man named Joseph who, though a member of the council, had not agreed to their plan and action. So right here, Luke is contradicting what it said in the earlier Gospels, that it was a unanimous decision. And Luke vaguely references a Jewish town of Arimathea for which we have no historical reference or evidence for. Let's see. And so Luke tells us that he did not agree to that. Sorry, I missed my spot. I guess I can touch on the low status of women. That's a common claim that people like to say. They say that women were not allowed to present evidence in court, and their testimony was not often considered for historical references. And this is completely, first of all, wrong, and secondly, completely irrelevant. We're not talking about a court case here, and women's accounts were often accepted as historical. We see it in the Old Testament, and we see it several times in the writings of Josephus, where the only eyewitness of an account is a woman, and Josephus references that woman, or Josephus references that woman, pardon me. You know what? I think I'm going to. I think I'm going to call that my time.
Good. About a minute and a half left, so about the same time as Jonathan. Okay. Pretty good.
Yeah, there's a couple more things, but I always want to get into something, but it'd take too long.
Okay. All right. So now we are going to move into the 10-minute rebuttals period. Jonathan, are you ready to go? You ready to go, Jonathan? You need to unmute. I don't know if you're ready to go or not.
All right.
All right. I'm going to hit start if you're ready, and go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you for that presentation. You'll recall in my opening statement that I presented 4 contending explanations for the origins of the belief in Christ's resurrection. Those were the myth hypothesis, that the gospel narratives concerning the resurrection are later developing myths that did not arise with the apostles. The second hypothesis was the hallucination hypothesis, or that the earliest followers of Jesus were deceived into thinking that he rose again. They somehow were honestly mistaken. Thirdly, the third contending hypothesis is that the followers of Jesus, in fact, they deceived others into thinking that he rose again, the conspiracy hypothesis. And finally, my fourth contending hypothesis, the resurrection of Jesus. And you will recall that I gave evidences against 3 of those contending hypotheses to leave the fourth contending explanation as the best, most causally adequate explanation for the origins of Jesus' resurrection, namely the resurrection hypothesis. And so I just want to reassert those points, and I look forward to hearing the rebuttal period how my opponent engages with those. Just to turn then to some of the points that were raised in my opponent's opening statement. He mentioned that the best accounts of Jesus are between 25 and 200 years after the death of Jesus. I'm sorry, that's just simply not true. I mean, the latest dating for the Gospel of John is like 90 to 95 CE. That's the last book of the New Testament canon to be written, given that date, and that's only some 50 years after the death of Jesus. So that's simply not true. I guess when he said 25 years as being the earliest point, I'm guessing he's referring to something like 1 Corinthians 15. But 1 Corinthians refers to material. He passes on creedal tradition, which actually dates within only 2 or 3 years of Jesus' death on the cross and his subsequent resurrection. So I would contest him on that particular point. He said that part of the punishment of crucifixion by the Romans was that crucifixion victims were not, in fact, given a proper burial. And this is absolutely true. This was generally the practice. The part of the punishment was that the crucifixion victim would be left on the cross, and this would be part of the humiliation and degradation of the crucifixion punishment. It would be left as a sign of humiliation and warning to others. However, the purpose for that, from the Roman perspective, was to stop people rising up, was to set examples and to deter people from rising up against the Roman authorities. However, in the Jewish case, it seems that that would have the opposite effect, because according to the Jewish concept, to have a body hanging on a tree was to be a curse to the land. That comes from Deuteronomy 21:23, where it says that that cursed is the man who is hung on a tree. And so it seems quite plausible that the Romans made special provisions for the Jews because of that, because it actually would have the opposite effect and make them more likely to rise up than otherwise. In fact, Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian, actually corroborates this in the Jewish War. This is in the Jewish War, Volume 4, Chapter 5. He says that the Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men that they took down those that were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. And so I think it's quite plausible then that Jesus, in fact, was given a decent and proper burial, being a Jew. He mentions that there's no mention in the Gospels of the Jewish burial rituals being performed by Joseph of Arimathea. So it's simply an argument from silence. It doesn't seem to me to be that compelling. He mentions that Paul does not mention the empty tomb in 1 Corinthians 15. So it's implied. I mean, Paul clearly believed in the bodily, physical resurrection of Jesus, not simply a spiritual resurrection. I'm happy to defend that claim if needed. But a bodily, physical resurrection implies an empty tomb. I mean, you can't have a bodily resurrection without an empty tomb. And Paul, in fact, does mention the burial of Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15. So I don't really see the point there either. He mentioned that Paul doesn't mention the miraculous events surrounding Jesus' death again. So he's passing on an oral creedal statement of the beliefs of the earliest church. That's not the agenda. It's not the purpose of him quoting that creed. It's a formulaic statement of the core beliefs concerning the death and burial and resurrection of Christ. It's highly stylized with this rhythmic structure. And I just don't see any reason why he would have to give a narrative surrounding it, like we see in the Gospels. He mentions that Paul tells the church in Corinth that Jesus appeared to more than 500 witnesses, and yet we have no records from those witnesses. That's true, but most of the literature from Palestine in the first century has been lost. If someone else wrote about this event, there's little reason to think that we should necessarily have his work still today. In fact, the argument from silence is notoriously full of difficulties. Josephus, for example, and Philo, who was a Jewish philosopher, Philo of Alexandria, both pass over the expulsion of the Jews from Rome by the Emperor Claudius in silence, although it's mentioned by the 2nd century Roman historian Suetonius in his Life of Claudius. And we have just one passing mention of the event in the 1st century source, which happens to be the book of Acts in chapter 18, verse 2. Despite Josephus' silence, all historians acknowledge that the event took place. And another example, no first century source that we now possess reports the destruction of Herculaneum and Pompeii in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79, although Pliny the Younger gives a detailed account of the eruption itself. In fact, his uncle, Pliny the Elder, was killed in that eruption. Yet no one infers from Pliny's silence that the event didn't take place. He mentions the supposed contradiction about the woman at the tomb and the angels at the tomb. However, as I'll show in just a moment, this is actually evidence for the empty tomb narrative, and I'll explain why in just a moment. If you look at Mark 16, verse 1, it says, when the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so they might go and anoint him. In Matthew 28, verse 1, it says, now after the Sabbath, towards the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. So we have multiple women going to see the tomb. Luke 24, verse 10, that says, now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other woman with them who told these things to the apostles. So we see from Matthew, Mark, and Luke that there were multiple women going to the tomb on Sunday morning. However, when we come to John chapter 20 and verse 2, John chapter 20 and verse 1, rather, it says that Mary Magdalene on Sunday morning went to find the tomb, and she discovered it empty. And so skeptics like Bart Ehrman and Jim Majors this evening have argued that this is in fact a contradiction between the gospel narratives. However, when we continue reading to verse 2, we read the following. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we," plural pronoun, "do not know where they have laid him." So Mary's choice of words in John reveals in passing that there were other women. John's report of these words shows that he in fact knows this. This is what I call the argument from reconcilable variations, where you have independent narratives which seem at first blush to contradict, but when you further inspect them, they actually fit together and harmonize readily without any straining whatsoever. And that, in fact, points to the independence of the narratives, and so it becomes evidence for the veracity. I mentioned the number of angels at the tomb. In Mark 16, verses 5 and 6, says, "Entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them," Matthew 28, verse 5 says, "But the angel said to the women," who got singular. And Luke 24, verse 4 says, "While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in dazzling apparel." However, Luke 24, verse 23, in fact, identifies those men as angels later in the narrative, so showing that the term is used interchangeably. Right, John says that there were two angels in white sitting at the body where Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. However, this is just spotlighting. It's just emphasizing one angel when in fact there was two angels. It's not a contradiction at all. So I don't think that's a compelling argument. Psalm 22, he mentioned the reading of "like the lion," which is the Masoretic reading, versus the reading of the Septuagint, which says "pierced." And he says that the "like the lion, they are at my hands and my feet" is the preferred reading. That's simply, I think, not the case. Sure, it's the Masoretic reading. However, the Septuagint does say "pierced," and in fact, the Hebrew word literally means to bore through. And also, you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which bear that reading out as well. And so, just I think that my opponent this evening has not presented his case convincingly, and he certainly hasn't addressed any of the points I brought up in my opening statement. But I look forward to seeing those in the rebuttal period. Thank you.
Good. Came in under 5 seconds. Good timing. All right, now we'll move to Jim's rebuttal. Jim, you ready to go?
Yeah. Okay.
All right. You can begin. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I didn't call them a contradiction. I don't believe they are contradictions, but they are inconsistencies. Yes, you can have one, and you can have two, and you can have three, and you can have four, and you can have five if you say that there are 10. But why say there are 10 if there are only 5? Why say there are 4 if there are only 1? Why say there's 1 if there are 4 or more? You know, and the authors of the Gospels don't do a very good job justifying their reason for only naming a certain number. And in the account that you talked about with where Mary's bringing the spices for anointing to the tomb and finds it empty, why is Mary going to anoint a body that other supposed eyewitnesses had already confirmed was anointed by Joseph of Arimathea and or Nicodemus? Let's see. What were the 3 things? I'm sorry, I wrote them down and I can't find them.
You're asking me?
Yeah. Sorry.
My 3 things for what?
The three questions you said that you wanted answered.
So I gave some contending explanations as to the origins of the resurrection belief, namely the conspiracy hypothesis.
Okay, yeah, the myth, hallucination, and conspiracy, right? Okay, well, I mean, I don't think it's very hard to look at these things chronologically in the way they're written, and figure out how this came about. For starters, the Romans had no problem accepting the belief of a rising god. Multiple historians document Romulus ascending during a storm, for whom his life is very well documented. So you have independent attestations of that. You have multiple attestations of things Muhammad did. that doesn't make it true. You have to analyze these things not only as a group, but against each other, as textual criticism and textual analysis and just general critique of scripture is it's essential to not just look at what's on the page, but what's in the page. Like, how did that develop? Where did that come from? Much like how we know that that Pauline Creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is an older traditional, most likely an oral tradition that was developed in the years after Jesus died. So conspiracy, hallucination, or myth. Hallucination. I very much think that what Paul experienced, I believe that that there are multiple attestations of a bright light, but Paul does not say anything about seeing Jesus. He hears his voice. When he is converted on the road to Damascus, there is no physical Jesus. There's a bright light from heaven, and that's it. And there is a voice that people can hear, but they can't understand. Apparently only Paul can understand. Other ones hear it, but it's like gibberish to them. Conspiracy, the followers deceived others into believing in the resurrection. I think that is very, very much plausible. And I think we have a lot of evidence for that. It doesn't take one person take Benny Hinn, for example. You go to a Benny Hinn church and you see all these people getting hit with a magic jacket. And as soon as it passes them, they all go flying back. Well, this is multiple attestations to the power of Benny Hinn's jacket. So all of these people are expressing their individual belief in his magic jacket and its powers. And so if you don't fall back, well, then you're just not holy. So if you don't believe in the resurrected Jesus, if Jesus didn't visit you, then you're just not holy. If he didn't appear in a locked room and eat fish with us, then you're not holy. And not when Paul comes around with this, obviously there is already a preconceived tradition of Jesus rising from the dead that was used to explain why the Messiah died, that he was coming back, and when he came back, it would be the return of the kingdom.
5 minutes.
Okay, and return of the kingdom. Where was I? Shit. Okay. Anyways, so conspiracy. It is not out of the realm of expectation that people would believe these things because they believed that other people believed that they were convinced. So, and that's how beliefs spread, isn't it? It's not because necessarily that we experience it for ourselves. It's because that we are convinced of another person's story, of another person's anecdotal evidence. Say, yeah, that sounds right. And oftentimes, we don't bother to Google it, and certainly didn't bother to Google it in first and second century Judea. So I think that's very plausible. Myth. I think there is some myth to it. I think most of the myth was unintentional, such as the mistranslations surrounding the virgin birth, some of the miracles, some of the parallels there. So there is some mythology there. There is some cosmic theology a little bit. But for the most part, I feel pretty comfortable saying that it's conspiracy. So if I was to say, I'd probably say that it's 10% hallucination, 70% conspiracy, 5% myth, and wait, how much is left? Whatever equals out to 0 for the resurrection. And with that, I conclude my time.
All right, you sure got 2.5 minutes left. If you want anything else you want to say.
See what I have. What else I have typed up over here? Those are just the notes I took from what he was saying on his intro statement. Okay, so if you look at Paul's list of resurrection appearances in 1 Corinthians, we already know that Paul has some credibility problems. We know that there's some disagreements between Paul and the author of Acts, who most people agree is Luke. And another thing, like to go back to the whole Benny Hinn jacket, he's got a lot of followers. He has his own organization. He has his own belief system, and he has people that pay him. So is his jacket really magical? I guess would be my question. And if it's not, given the multiple attestations, given the eyewitness accounts, given the independent anecdotal sources, given the video evidence, how can you say that Benny Hinn's jacket is not magical? And that's I think that's it.
All right, then we can move into the cross-examination time. These will be 6 minutes each, so keep both your mics open. Jonathan, you can start whenever you're ready. Let me just get my timer ready. All right, we're good to go.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim. That was interesting. You mentioned that the Romans had no problem documenting belief in a rising God. And I wanted to ask why you think that's relevant, given that the authors of the Gospels were Jewish and not Roman.
Oh, are we going back and forth?
Yes, I'm asking questions for.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Ask me again.
All right. So you mentioned that the Romans had no problem documenting belief in a rising God. And I want to know why you think that's relevant, given that the Gospels were written by Jews and not Romans.
Oh, that's no problem. Because they were out to convert Gentiles in the end. In the end, they had to convert Roman pagans. It was, well, what I'm saying is, like, it wasn't a far reach to get somebody to believe that a deity had risen from the dead.
But you know that there we have records of Gentiles mocking Christians for their belief in a risen Christ. For example, Theophilus of Antioch, who's a 2nd century church father, had a dialogue with a pagan by the name of Autolycus. And Theophilus said to Autolycus, "Now, as to your saying that the dead are not raised, for you say, show us even one who's been raised from the dead, that seeing we may believe." There's another passage also in Justin Martyr's first apology to the Romans, where he actually gives an apologetic for the possibility of resurrection. So it seems that that's not really a good argument to me.
Well, I mean, I feel like it is, because I mean these resurrections. I mean, let's take. I mean, I know it's Roman, but take Romulus for example. I mean, there's multiple attestations to that. There are multiple people who saw it happen and who claimed to have seen it happen. But we all know that the senators got ticked off at what he was doing and took him out back and stabbed him and buried him in a shallow grave somewhere.
So, as I understand it, Romulus wasn't crucified, and he was taken up into the heavens while still alive.
Right, and there are no other death accounts that we know of how else Romulus died.
But it's not the sort of resurrection that we see in Christianity. In any case,
but it's an ascension into heaven.
Right, but it's not a resurrection in the sense of Christianity. And in any case, the Jews had no belief in a dying, much less a rising Messiah. In fact, as you mentioned, the Pharisees believed in a general resurrection at the end of the world, not a first fruits resurrection of one individual to glory and immortality in the middle of history. And the Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection at all. So it seems to me that there's no credible motivation for them to invent this if they're convincing a Jewish audience. And it seems to me that it wouldn't convince a Greco-Roman audience. I mean, in fact, a lot of the Greco-Roman audience viewed the physical world or the material world as defiling and corrupting, and so to be released from the physical material world by death, you wouldn't want that back. It was wholly undesirable, not just impossible, to be from the dead. So I don't buy that argument at all, I'm afraid.
Well, yeah, well, and that's why Paul was having such a hard time with the Corinthians, because they were like, well, what do you mean in the end we're all going to be raised bodily? Like, I don't want my body back. Like, this isn't what I want. Like, I thought this was just a spiritual resurrection. Like, you're saying that Jesus rose from the dead, physically, and you're saying that I'll get that eventually. That's not what I want.
I mean, that's not what Paul's saying in Philippians. I assume you're quoting Philippians.
No, Corinthians, 1 Corinthians.
So what verse are you referring to, 1 Corinthians?
Let me pull it
You guys have 2 minutes on this one left.
Okay, let's just move on then.
up. Okay, sorry.
Let's just so you take the let's see. You mentioned that you opt for the conspiracy theory as the dominant theory of the origins of the Christian belief of the resurrection. Is that right?
I'm not cementing myself there, but I mean, just yeah. I feel like right now that's where I'm at.
Okay, so I mean, it seems to me that first of all, liars make poor martyrs, as I mentioned, because
I'm sorry, what was that?
Liars make poor martyrs. I mean, people will die for something they think is the truth, but we have at least records for some of the apostles having died as martyrs. Not all of them, but some. Peter, for example, we have multiple. We have at least 2 first-century sources. We have
and how do they each say that he died?
Well, Clement of Rome doesn't tell us, but he does tell us that he died as a martyr in First Clement, which is written. Most scholars date to AD 96, although some people date it a bit earlier. And John 21 anticipates his death. That Jesus tells him that he was going to be crucified. It is clearly a prediction about crucifixion, and it seems unlikely that John would have invented this and put it into the mouth of Jesus had it not already happened by that point, because otherwise it would kill.
But it had most certainly happened by the time John was authored.
Exactly, that's the point. So John,
isn't that like retroactively fitting that?
But I'm not making an argument from prophecy here. I'm making an argument from attestation to the death of Peter, because John was most likely written after so it was attestation.
Sure, but what's to say that they didn't get that information from the other source?
Because
that's time.
Okay,
so that's time. Okay, so now we're going to go to Jim's cross-examination. So Jim, you can begin.
Wait. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so
let me know when you're ready.
I'm ready. Okay, so how did Paul know that it was Jesus who appeared to him at the road to Damascus?
How did Paul know that it was Jesus who appeared to him on the road to Damascus? Well, he introduced himself. Said, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting." And incidentally, on that point, you actually made a mistake in your previous rebuttal when you said that Paul doesn't tell us that he saw Jesus, because he actually does. It's in 1 Corinthians 9. He says, "Am I not an apostle, having not seen Jesus Christ our Lord?" And it's also in 1 Corinthians 15 as well.
Right, but what is that referencing, though? It's referencing the bright light, right?
Yeah. He sees a bright light, and he's according to 1 Corinthians 9, he actually saw Jesus.
Right, but it says that he saw a bright light and he was blinded. Like, he didn't in the account in Acts say anything about seeing Jesus.
He actually does say that. Well, he hears a voice. Well, he sees a bright light, and he hears a voice introducing himself as Jesus. "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting."
Right.
It doesn't tell us specifically that he actually saw Jesus, but Paul does in his own words, and we can take Paul's word for it even more so than Acts, because we're hearing straight from the horse's mouth when we read 1 Corinthians.
Okay. Do you think John altered the day Jesus was crucified on?
Actually, no. We can discuss that if you want.
Yeah, go ahead and give me like your little 30-second elevator answer.
Sure. So let me just pull up the text here real quick. So the text is in, okay, so in Mark, so this is a contradiction. So in Mark 14, verse 12, it says, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, "Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And then the Last Supper follows. In John 19:14, it says, "Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover." And so Bart Ehrman and others argue that in Mark, the Last Supper takes place on the first day of Passover. Jesus is arrested that night and crucified on the next day. The first day is the Jews' reckoned days of Passover. And according to Bart Ehrman and others, many others, John tells us that the crucifixion took place on the day of preparation for Passover, the day before the Passover. Now, briefly, John doesn't, in fact, tell us that it was the day of preparation for the Passover. He says it was the day of preparation of the Passover. Mark uses the same term, but he also tells us what it means. If you look at Mark 15, verse 42, it says, "When evening had come, since it was a day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath." In other words, preparation means preparation for the Sabbath. Now, if you read John more closely, John 19, verse 31, it says, "Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and they might be taken away." So John actually agrees with Mark that it was the day before the Sabbath.
No, but he doesn't agree with him though, because you're also not touching on the part where he says Jews. He doesn't say anything about Joseph of Arimathea, but rather the Jews are appealing to Pilate to remove the bodies
Exactly.
of all three.
Exactly. So what's the motivation, though, for them wanting to remove the body from the cross? It's because the next day is a Sabbath. So it actually is the day of preparation for the Sabbath, not the day of preparation.
Right. Well, of course they would want that, but the fact of the matter is that they most certainly would not have allowed a usurper to be taken off of the cross, not even on a Sabbath. That was only reserved in very extenuating circumstances for people who were not enemies of the state, for people who were not claiming to be king.
As I actually addressed this in my openings or my rebuttal, where I give you a quote from Josephus, where he says that bodies were typically removed from the cross before sundown.
Yes, but he also is not outlining what their crimes are. The punishment for usurpers is much worse than it was for just for somebody else. For example, we know from some accounts that some people were just tied to a cross, but Jesus had nails driven into his hand. Probably in addition to it, he had a crown of thorns. He had a humiliating sign. So I mean, this wasn't your typical crucifixion. For example, the thieves who either one mocked or both mocked. We don't have to touch on that, but there are no additional details of their crucifixion that would allude to them going through anything like what Jesus did, or anything like that. So we know that Jesus' crucifixion was not a normal punishment by any means.
Demonstrating what typically happens, namely that the bodies would be left on the cross, isn't evidence necessarily for that having happened in this case. In any case, Pilate.
But by itself, it's not. But when you add in all the other information, the extenuating means that they went through to make sure that Jesus suffered and was humiliated, we know that this was not one of those circumstances.
But that's what happened in every crucifixion. And in fact, the reason Pilate had Jesus crucified was because he was pressured to do so by the Jewish authorities. And so having a Jewish authority, namely Joseph of Arimathea, coming and requesting that the body be released, in this particular situation, perhaps Pilate, released the body to him. And we know that the Romans made concessions to Jews on other issues. And the Jews considered a body being left on a cross to be a defilement to the land. So I think it's quite logical.
That's time.
Okay.
So, all right, now we will move to the 5-minute closing statements. So, Jonathan, if you're ready to go, you can go get started.
Well, again, I would like to thank my opponent for engaging in spirited discussion this evening. I'm thankful for him taking the time to engage these issues, and I hope that that you, the audience, also have benefited from the exchange and have been provoked in your thoughts. You will recall, as I gave my opening presentation, that I gave 4 contending explanations for the origins of the belief among early Christians that Jesus rose from the dead. Those were the myth hypothesis, namely that the earliest followers of Jesus did not claim Jesus rose from the dead. In fact, the resurrection narratives are later myths. Secondly, that his followers were deceived into thinking he rose again, or the hallucination hypothesis. Thirdly, that his followers deceived others into thinking he rose again. And finally, that he in fact did rise again. You recall that I refuted the first one by giving 2 lines of evidence, namely the creed quoted by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, which establishes that the resurrection claim goes all the way back to the earliest apostolic community, the original eyewitnesses. And also Acts chapter 2, I showed that the author of Luke Acts was present with Paul, a traveling companion of Paul, and was present with him in Jerusalem in Acts 21, and with him in Caesarea in prison, close to Jerusalem. And so he had access to the living witnesses to Christ's resurrection. And so he was in a position to know what was being claimed by the Jerusalem apostles. And so we can trust how he represents their view concerning the resurrection in Acts chapter 2, when he mentions that Peter proclaimed the resurrection boldly at Pentecost in Jerusalem. I also argued against the hallucination hypothesis by pointing out that the resurrection appearances were polymodal in character, multisensory, involving multiple sensory modes, not just sight, but group sightings, group conversations, physical contact with Jesus, eating with Jesus at the shore of the Sea of Galilee, etc. And it was also extended across 40 days, not just one brief, confusing episode. That seems to me to militate heavily against the hallucination hypothesis. Thirdly, that Jesus' followers deceived others into thinking that he rose again. The conspiracy hypothesis, I refuted that by showing that the apostles were willing to suffer and die as martyrs for their faith. And multi-party conspiracies, when life or liberty are at stake, invariably break down. Many people will die for something they think is the truth, but no one will die for something that they know to be a lie. And we have attestation for at least some of the apostles dying as martyrs. In particular, Peter, whom I mentioned, we have 2 first-century sources documenting the martyrdom of, and James, the Lord's brother, who was, and I don't think actually Josephus and Hegesippus necessarily contradict. I think they complement one another. I think James was thrown from the Temple Mount and survived, and then was bludgeoned to death by the Jews. And also the conspiracy theory, I think, also breaks down because we have the gospel authors have a track record of being reliable and being habitual truth tellers. And so I think that the conspiracy theory also doesn't really explain the data at hand. Finally, then, the resurrection hypothesis, I think, does explain the evidence, and also not just has the greatest explanatory power in explaining each of the observations singularly, but also the greatest explanatory scope to explain the range of data collectively. We haven't even discussed really the empty tomb. I think there's tremendous evidence for the empty tomb, which we haven't even been able to get into. And there's also far more evidence besides for the veracity of the resurrection appearances of Jesus. Finally, then, what are the implications of this for us? Well, I think that the resurrection of Christ is the most important, bar none, doctrine of our creed as Christians. The Christianity rests, hangs or falls on the veracity of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. If Jesus has been raised, and I think the evidence strongly supports that he was, then Jesus has been vindicated as God's Messiah, as Israel's Messiah. He has been vindicated as to his claims to deity, to divine status. And as such, he, as the God-man, walked among us on this earth. He went to that cross, having lived a perfectly righteous and holy life. He went to the cross of Calvary, and upon himself, he absorbed all that judgment and indignation of a just and holy and righteous God, all that wrath that we, you and me, deserved. Christ bore that wrath, such that if we trust in Christ, throwing ourselves at the foot of the cross and repenting of our sins and crying out to Jesus for salvation, then we can enjoy eternity of fellowship with Jesus Christ, because Christ is mighty to save. He is a tremendous Savior. And so follow the evidence and find the Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you for your attention.
All right, good. With 10 seconds to spare. All right, Jim, if you're ready to go, I can hit start, and you got 5 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I will concede that Paul had had knowledge of most Christian traditions. That's very much obvious. That's something that I wouldn't dream of contesting. I do, however, contest that the apostles suffer and die, and that is evidence. We have 2 accounts in the New Testament, for whom one, the external sources most certainly seem to contradict, and scholars agree with that. And then you have Judas, who there's contradictions involving that, whether he got run over by a chariot, or if he hung himself, or if he fell forward and spewed his guts, and his guts spilled out, or whatever. so your three criteria, or I'm sorry, your four possibilities: the myth possibility, the hallucination, conspiracy, and the resurrection. I would challenge you to disprove Benny Hinn's jacket. Benny Hinn's jacket is either a myth, it's either a hallucination, it's either a conspiracy, or it's a real magic jacket. So either it is mythologized and people just talk about it, and it's stories of old, and it's just rumors, which we know it's not true because it's on video. We have it on video. We can email somebody right now who's experienced it and believes in it. So hallucination, are the effects a hallucination? Or is it a conspiracy? Is everybody in the audience just in on it together? Are they paid off prior and they're just falling with the jacket? Or is it a real jacket? You have to examine the evidence that you have for it. And it's, we can see the jacket now. We can test that. But what I will say is that given what evidence we do have for the resurrection, I think that we can look at the other claims within those sources, such as with Josephus, with the Gospels, and we can see where, not necessarily with the resurrection, but with other crucial key points of Jesus's life that have been mythologized, that have been hallucinated, that have been conspired, that are not actual historical events. We know of interpolations. We know of edits. We know of just outright stealing from Old Testament prophecies that weren't even meant for Jesus. So we see a lot of retroactive fitting. So we know these sources to be unreliable. So yes, while there is multiple attestation, as vague though as they may be, they are altogether unreliable. Yeah, I really appreciate you taking your time to debate me on this topic, and had a really great discussion. Thank you.
All right, that should be it. We can move to the Q&A. I mean, every time you keep mentioning Benny Hinn's jacket, I have so many memes flashing through my head.
Thank you very much.
With that, James, we ready to move to Q&A?
You bet. So thank you very much. Definitely enjoyed this, and I'm also very excited about the Q&A, as you can imagine. So I have emailed the questions to Mike. We will take turns going back and forth reading these, and I'll give Mike just a minute or two because I got to read through the super chats. I want to say thanks so much for your super chats. Carrie gives a response or a comment, and so for the debaters, I always forget to go over the super chat rules. They are allowed to give a comment toward one of the debaters, to which then the debater can give a response to that comment, just like as if they were answering a question. So Carrie81, thanks so much. She says, wouldn't it have saved a lot of debate, trouble, and time and violence if Jesus had shown himself to Pilate and gone to Caesar and spoke with non-believers? So I think that's for John.
Yeah, I think so.
Excellent question. However, I think that we have sufficient reason to believe on the basis of the testimony of the apostle. And the question assumes a lot about God's intention in salvation, whether and the means that He uses to bring about salvation of different individuals. So I don't think that Jesus necessarily needed to go and appear in person to Pilate or Caesar or what have you. So I don't find that argument particularly convincing.
Gotcha. And thank you very much. And Chris Hembry, thanks so much for your super chat. He says, great channel. Totally appreciate the encouragement, Chris. We're glad you're here. And all credit to the debaters. This has been thrilling for me. Joshua Brister, thanks for your super chat. This is questionable. Jim, if you want to do me a favor and not go beyond its intensity, Joshua Brister has a super chat for you. We said that we don't want any abusive super chats. This one's questionable. And I'm like, but I don't want to be too much of a stickler. He says,
Oh no, go for it.
He says, Jim of Atheist Republic, I'm not impressed by your performance. So if you want to give a response, you can.
That's fine, Josh. You suck.
Gotcha. Joshua Brister says, thanks for your second super chat. Josh, he says, great debates coming soon to Red Pill Religion.
Highly doubt that, but okay.
Silfredo Saravia, thanks so much for your super chat as well. He says, wouldn't, sorry, that had just a little bit of background noise surprised me. But he said, wouldn't Jesus be anti-Christian if he sits on the right hand of God eternally, or if Jesus says, quote unquote, I and my Father are one, though Father is not the Son?
That to me?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes, so.
Okay. Can you just repeat that question, because I'm not sure I understood it.
You bet. It's so he says, wouldn't Jesus be anti-Christian if he sits on the right hand of God eternally, or if Jesus says, quote unquote, I and my Father are one, though the Father is not the Son?
Okay, I'm not quite sure I understand, but let me have a go for it. Do you understand the question, James? Just in case you can provide clarity.
I wish I did. That's all I got, and to be honest, I
Yeah,
don't.
I'm trying to figure it out myself.
I think maybe what he's saying is that Jesus is portrayed as sitting at the right hand of God, and yet in John 10 verse 30 it says, I and the Father are one, and so maybe this is a contradiction. Maybe that's what he's saying. If that's the case, then no, because I and the Father are one is in the sense of ontology and purpose. They're one both in purpose and bring about salvation. That's the context. And John 10 verse 30, if you look at the context carefully, is clearly teaching the deity of Christ. The Son is equal to the Father and participates in his deity. Jesus also portrays himself as sitting at the right hand of God, which is a reference or an allusion back to Daniel 7 verse 13 and 14, where Daniel sees in his vision at night one who looks like a son of man, and also Psalm 110, more particularly Psalm 110, where it speaks about David's Lord, who's Yahweh says to Adonai, meaning my Lord, sit at my right hand till make your enemies your footstool. So the sitting at the right hand of God, I think, signifies his equality with God, and there's no contradiction there. I mean, the biblical Trinitarian theology is that the Father and Son are one in essence, but they're separate persons. The Father is not the Son is not the Father. So I and the Father are one simply shows us that they're one in essence, one as to their being, even though they're separate persons. I hope that clarifies. I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
It's like a clown car being expressed as three different clown cars.
Gotcha. So thank you for that super chat and for your response, Jonathan. Next up, we have Chris Foster. Thanks for your question. He says, question for John. If Abraham told Lazarus that all people needed to do was believe in Moses and other prophets, and then in parentheses he puts Luke 16:31, then why was a public resurrection of Jesus so important?
Can you repeat that again? Sorry.
Yeah, you bet. So he says, if Abraham told Lazarus that all people needed to do was believe in Moses, so I think he's talking about when Jesus tells the parable of Lazarus. He says, if Abraham told Lazarus that all people needed to do was believe in Moses and other prophets, and that's in Luke 16:31, then why was a public resurrection of Jesus so important?
So I mean, Jesus also alludes to the fact that Moses and the prophets bear him testimony. The resurrection becomes the icing on the cake in terms of evidence. Jesus was asked in the Gospels for a sign, for example, after he's cleansed the temple in John 2, in verses 18 and 19, when the Jews say, what miraculous sign do you show us for doing these things? And he was able to destroy the temple, rebuild it in 3 days. Speaking of his body, he also on another occasion says, wicked and adulterous generation looked for a sign, but no sign will be given except for the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, or the great fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, speaking about his resurrection from the dead. And there's numerous other references where he speaks about his resurrection being the vindication of his messianic credentials and self-claims.
When did Jesus cleanse the temple, and how many times?
I believe that he cleansed it twice, once at the beginning of his ministry and once at the end.
Why do they each not mention both of them? Like, for instance, why doesn't John mention the earlier one?
Well, I don't think they need to mention every event that happens in Jesus' life.
Well, no, they don't, but it would make your argument a lot better.
I don't see why it's implausible to posit that something happened on more than one occasion. Just a few points quickly on that, if you want. First of all, both of the episodes where Jesus cleanses the temple happen in the lead up to Passover, which is interesting because in the lead up to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Jews would actually cleanse their homes of leaven, and so Jesus symbolically cleanses his house, namely the temple of leaven. And so it's significant that on both occasions it's the lead up to Passover. Interesting also that in John 2:18 and 19, when the Jews ask him after he's cleansed the temple, what sign do you show us for doing these things? And Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And of course, this is a reference to his resurrection. It goes on to explain. Interesting that in Matthew 26:61 and in Mark 14:58, when Jesus is at his interrogation before the high priest Caiaphas, and the false witnesses step forward and say, we heard this man say, I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days I'll build another, but not by human hands. Neither Matthew nor Mark give us a pretext for that accusation. It's only John.
Right. Well, it's because they're talking about it the day after. They were recollecting what had happened the day before during the trial. Like, oh, I remember during the trial he had said this, and so therefore, because they were avoiding having to deal with anything on the Sabbath because you know how that went.
Well, you're speculating at that point. I think it's a reference back to.
I don't think that's really speculating. That's just pretty much just seeing it for what it is.
And he may have said that on more than one occasion, but in any case, John gives us the pretext, but not the later accusations and misrepresentations. The synoptic gives us the pretext, but not later accusations. Or rather, John gives us the pretext, and the synoptics gives the later accusations. Very finally, more spectacularly, there's a really interesting connection. If you continue reading in John 2, it says, the Jews then said, it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days. So, when did, according to Josephus, what's the approximate dating of the commence of the building of the temple by Herod the Great? Well, it's 19 BC. If you add 46 years to 19 BC, you get to 26 AD. The very same date that Luke gives us in Luke chapter 3, because in Luke chapter 3, Luke tells us that Jesus began his public ministry in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, which would be if Caesar Tiberius began to be co-emperor with Augustus in 12 AD. Augustus died in 14, but he was co-emperor in 12 AD. So 15th year would be 14 plus a bit, which lands us again in 26 AD. So the time frames calibrate very, very well, and synchronize very, very well, pointing to the veracity of the account.
Oh, it was being this, they synchronized so well. What year was Jesus born?
So this, you're going to the whole Herod the Great versus Quirinius, the governor of Syria issue.
Well, not only that, but you have other issues like for instance, the dating of Jesus' birth, using the Magi story, which is only outlined. It isn't outlined in all the Gospels. We don't hear the Magi story, or that Herod was even looking for baby Jesus in one of the Gospels. So and then you have the problem with the dating of the crucifixion. You have problems there as well, especially if you're trying to account in a solar eclipse.
Sorry, say that last point.
The solar eclipse, when the sky went dark, that's what and the earthquake. There's been some studies about seismic activity saying that they can date an earthquake to the year 31. I believe it was 31 CE. And then there's some other evidence that points that the crucifixion being in 34 or even in 29. And then of course Jesus couldn't be born anywhere between the overlapping reigns.
There's differences of opinion as to the death of Jesus and even the birth of Jesus. Some people think that Jesus.
Right. Well, isn't that a problem though for a historical figure, especially like the key figure of Christianity, that there is no that it's an opinion of when he was born, and that there's no fact of when he was born?
I think we're going to give Jonathan a quick response, and then we got to get back to the Q&A.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, James.
You're not seriously suggesting Jesus didn't exist, are you?
No, not at all. What I am saying is that the records of his birth and who he was, that it was so retroactively fitted to match their own individual agendas and prophecies that they were looking at, that it created serious conflicts in the dating.
I don't see why this is an important issue.
Okay, fair enough.
I mean, we can talk about the date of Jesus' birth if you want, very briefly. But
no, it's all right. James had one more response, and we can move on.
So we'll jumping back to the Q&A. Sil, forgive me if I mispronounce it. Silafrido Sarabia, thanks so much for your super chat. He says, does God have an obligation if his son is salvation? I think this is for Jonathan. I'm not fully sure what it means, but maybe it's just because I've been sitting in idle. Maybe you do.
Sorry, repeat the question.
Yeah, no problem. He says, does God have an obligation if his son is salvation?
Does he have an obligation? I'm not sure what he means by that. So maybe if you could clarify what he means by that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We can come back to that if we see another from him, if he clarifies. He said, and another one, thanks for your super chat, Silafredo, appreciate it. He says, do atheists need proof for Jesus before belief in a deity?
No, I believe in a historical Jesus. And there are several religions that don't require a Jesus or a Messiah belief to believe in a deity. So, I mean, I would say no.
Gotcha. And Josh Brister, thanks for your super chat as well. He says, again, great debates are coming soon to Red Religion. So, thanks, Josh. And Josh also says in another super chat, is Jim smoking cocaine? So we appreciate that. You guys are like brothers.
Wow, that guy is off the hinge, like for real.
He just loves you, though, Jim. So we can go to the Q&A. Mike Jones, we appreciate it. If you're ready to go with the first question, and then I'll just piggyback off of you, and we'll keep alternating.
Yeah, no worries. No bullshit. Says, please ask Jonathan where Paul says the risen Jesus was experienced in a way that was not a vision. So that's to you, Jonathan.
I think it was Corinthians 9, right? You point to?
Yeah, and also, I mean, he doesn't tell us it was a vision or not a vision, so it's not clear from Paul's letter. He says in 1 Corinthians 9, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Etc. And 1 Corinthians 15, he also says, last of all, he appeared to me also as to one untimely born, which seems to suggest it was the same sort of appearance as the apostles. He mentions also in Galatians 1 that the gospel was revealed to him by revelation from Jesus himself. He mentions where I would have you know, this is verse 11, where I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel, for I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. So it was a revelation of Jesus Christ, but he doesn't, I don't think it's clear enough from Paul's letters to know in what sense Jesus appeared to him. I think it was clearly a physical apparition, but as to the nature of that, it's not clear from Paul's letters. I don't think it was merely like a dream.
I agree with you there that you can't tell. It's pretty ambiguous through Paul's writings, through the letters that are actually his, anyways. But when you take into account Acts, for example, I think it's pretty clear that it was just a lie.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And then Stickman Sam has a question for Jim. He asks, can you think of at least 3 things that lower your confidence that Jesus never rose from the dead?
3 things?
That's right.
3 things. Let's see. Well, what would really help would be attestations from Nicodemus and or Joseph of Arimathea. For sure, knowing where the tomb was would really help. Some people believe that it was Joseph of Arimathea's personal tomb, which I find it was really convenient that the tomb was literally just a stone's throw from where Jesus was crucified. Like out of all of the tombs in the area, there happened to be a newly carved one for Jesus just right over there. So that was convenient.
Gotcha. Go ahead, Mike.
Did I answer that question?
I think he wanted 3, but it's okay.
Oh, 3. I guess the personal accounts of them, and for the resurrection, man. I mean, that is some really hardcore evidence, because we're talking about something outside of the physical realm. We're talking about something that is not ordinarily observed. In fact, I can't remember the last time I saw anybody resurrected. I got to think about that one. I don't think I ever have. And I don't think anybody alive has either, if they're being honest with themselves. So I guess I would have to see some proof that a resurrection is possible.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right, so then next question. Please ask Jonathan if 1 Corinthians 5 or 1 Corinthians 15, 5-8 can be plausibly interpreted as Paul equating his vision of with the other appearances. If so, then wouldn't that falsify Orthodox Christianity?
Why would it? Sorry, I'm not sure why he thinks it would falsify Orthodox Christianity. Why would it?
I think he's saying, like, if Paul's vision, if Paul had a vision, he equates it with the other appearances of the disciples in 1 Corinthians 15. Wouldn't that falsify the physical resurrection? Because he's just saying they all had visions.
No, because he indicates that it was a bodily resurrection. So that wouldn't falsify Christianity. Even if it was the case that there were visions on the part of the other apostles, that wouldn't falsify Christianity, because Paul clearly, or Orthodox Christianity, because Paul nonetheless clearly indicates the bodily resurrection of Christ that's present there in 1 Corinthians 15. It's also present in Philippians, where he says, I think it's in chapter 3, where he says that God will transform our lowly bodies to be like his heavenly body. So he's speaking about a transformation of the body, just like Christ's body was transformed. I think Paul even indicates that his resurrection appearance was different in some respect from the other apostles, because he says he appeared to Cephas and to the 12, and he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. Most of them were still alive, some had fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. And so when he says as to one untimely born, he means, well, Jesus had already ascended, and so he was kind of late to the party. And Jesus appeared to him after the ascension, even though he'd already ascended. So I don't think that's a good argument myself.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And Stickman Sam asks, question for Jim. Given that Jesus never rose from the dead, what's more likely, the disciples moving on with their lives, or risking it by continuing their dead master's movement?
Say it one more time.
I think he's saying, granting your view that Jesus never rose from the dead,
yeah,
what's more likely, that the disciples would move on with their lives, or that they would risk their lives by continuing their dead master's movement?
Well, I mean, if you have one person that gets knocked down by Benny Hinn's jacket, everybody who wants to appear to be holy is going to fall down with him. So if one person has the experience, like I've heard so many times, my grandmother passed away, and I woke up and she was sitting on the edge of my bed, and she gave me a hug and told me everything was going to be all right, and that she'd see me one day. And other members of the family see it, and they say that they saw it. I mean, we see this happen all the time whenever somebody is grieving the loss of a loved one, that they so badly want these people back, and it's very possible that the other ones weren't even just making it up to go along, that they could have been having their own experiences just because they too were experiencing that grief, in addition to Jesus appeared to them, why isn't he appearing to me? And so, yeah, I guess that's what I would say, is that it doesn't it doesn't take everyone experiencing Jesus. It just takes one person having that encounter.
You bet.
Next question is from Epic Christ. Question to Jim: how can you say there was no such thing as Jewish burial when Yohanan was found in a tomb?
I didn't say there's no such thing as Jewish burial.
Fair enough.
Gotcha. And then, next up, HistoryNet asks, question for Jim. His divinity aside, what do you think of Yeshua as a person?
Yeshua as a person? I think, as he's described in the Bible, I think that he was an apocalyptic preacher, probably pretty charismatic. He was most likely xenophobic, judging by his encounter with the Canaanite woman, and his and the lack of spread to Gentiles until Paul got involved. And I guess I would say that for where he was at the time, he was probably a pretty good dude, but in today's standards, he was probably kind of a dick.
Gotcha. Oh, Mike, I think you're on mute.
Next question is from Capturing Christianity. Question for Jim: what's the best argument in defense of the claim that God does not exist?
What is the best argument? What was the rest
in defense of the claim that God doesn't exist.
In defense of the claim that God does exist?
Does not exist.
Oh, does not exist. The best evidence. The best evidence is the lack of evidence.
Next up.
All right, fair enough.
Thank you for that question. And Pine Creek, thanks for your question. He says, for Jonathan, I understand that you believe the resurrection is the best explanation, but what, in your opinion, would be the second best explanation?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I think that from the explanations I gave, or the categories of explanation I gave, I think that the conspiracy theory, I think, just doesn't cut it at all. I think that it is very clearly false. I think, and most scholars would agree with that, by the way. Most scholars would think that the earliest apostles sincerely believed that Jesus had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. Whether you're an atheist like Gerd Ludemann, or a Jewish scholar, Paul Fredrickson, or a Christian scholar, across the spectrum, most scholars would agree with that. The conspiracy theory seems to me to be really difficult to defend. The hypothesis that the resurrection narratives are later myths also seems to me to be very difficult to defend. I think that most scholars would also agree with me on that the resurrection claim at least goes back to the apostles themselves. There's tremendous evidence supporting that. I think overwhelming evidence supporting that.
To be fair, though, most Islamic scholars believe that Muhammad split the moon in half.
Well, we're not just talking about Christian scholars, we're talking about scholars across the spectrum. But in any case, the hypothesis that the disciples were somehow honestly mistaken seems to me to be the only route that the non-believer can go down, which I think is the best candidate alternative explanation. How they came to sincerely believe that seems to me to be difficult to posit. I think that the fact that the resurrection appearances were polymodal in character, and also extending across such a long period as 40 days, I think speaks against that hypothesis. And also coming to the Benny Hinn jacket illustration, which has come up several times now, and I haven't responded to it. The resurrection appearances are just qualitatively different from Benny Hinn's jacket. I mean, if you're sitting down for a meal on the shore of the Sea of Galilee with someone, you know whether it was your friend that you're having breakfast with. I mean, if you're having a group conversation with someone, either you're having that group conversation or you're not. I mean, there's no two ways about it. So I think it's just qualitatively different from Benny Hinn's jacket.
I don't see how, because where do you put that at? Do you call it a myth? Do you call it a hallucination or a conspiracy?
Of the categories I gave for Benny Hinn's jacket, I would say that the people who fall for that are honestly mistaken. I think that I think that Benny Hinn probably. I'm not sure whether Benny Hinn is sincere or not.
Right.
There's arguments.
Well, no. I'm not arguing about whether he's sincere. I'm not talking about the people who are reacting to him swinging his.
I think they're sincere. So I think
sure.
For the most part, at least. So I think that.
Right.
That the hallucination hypothesis of the categories I gave would best fit that particular data.
Okay. Do you think that's
if it's okay?
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. Just to get through as many. Forgive me, Mike. Was it my
Next
turn or
one's-
yours?
It's my turn.
Okay.
It's Chris Hembre. If Jonathan claims to approach the Gospels as a critical historian does, can he tell us if he thinks the Gospels contain any historical errors? If so, can he give a few examples?
So I actually haven't been convinced so far that there are errors in the Gospels. There's a few candidates that I think that are possible historical errors, but I think, and I'll give one example. I think in those cases, and there's only a few examples where I think there were plausible candidates. In those cases, at worst, these are what I would call good faith errors, where the author has, just made a mistake about, the order of an event or the time of an event or something like that. It's not something that's malicious on the part of the author, but simply a good faith mistake. I haven't been, as I said, convinced of any to this point, but there are some that I think are plausible candidates. One is the order in which, you have Jesus approaching Bethany in John chapter 12, and then you have the triumphal entry, and before the triumphal entry, according to John's Gospel, you have Jesus anointed at Bethany by the woman with the expensive ointment. Whereas if you go over to the Synoptic Gospels, like if you go over to Mark, Mark chapter 14, this is after the triumphal entry, and then it says, and while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. So if you maintain that that's not an error, the only way I think of reading that is to take the Greek word kai in verse 3, which is translated "and," as not temporal, not having tempo specificity, so he's just giving us another indication of something else that happened at Bethany, and kai is used in that way elsewhere in the Gospels and in Greek literature. So it's possible, but I think that's an example of a place where there's a possible candidate for an error in the Gospels. But again, at worst, that would be a good faith mistake rather than a malicious one.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And then want to just mention that this is probably going to be our last question. So just because we want to respect the debater's time. Jonathan, by the way, he is in England. So for him, if I'm right, Jonathan, it's going on 11 p.m.
Yeah, it's coming up to, it's almost 11, yeah.
So we appreciate you staying up late with us. And last one, Landon Freeman, thanks for your question. He says, a question for Jim. What religion defined as in quote-unquote including a deity do you believe has the most evidence in support of it?
Oh, which religion involving a deity has the most evidence for it?
Right.
I mean, there's evidence for the religion. The religion exists, but if you're trying to get me to say which deity has more evidence for its existence, I mean, it would just be an argument ad populum, honestly. So I really couldn't say.
You got it. Well, thank you very much for those questions, everybody. Thank you for the debaters, most of all, for and we know they love debating. They definitely have a passion for it, but nonetheless, the fact that they came on to Modern Day Debate, we really appreciate it. It's great to have you both. And thank you, Mike, for moderating. We appreciate all three of you. Last, as mentioned, Capturing Christianity is hosting another debate on the resurrection. That's next month, and that's going to be Mike Winger and Matt Dillahunty, so that will be a big one, and that is linked down in the description, so you can check that out. And then also we encourage, without giving away too much info, we will say that Non Sequitur Show has been very gracious about sharing about our debates, and so we will say they also have a lot of great debates that you can check out as well. So want to say thank you for everybody being here, and with that, keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable, and have a great day or night.